Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Reading Genesis with Jesus, our small group series. I have Dr. Andrew Steinman here with us again today. And we're in week 4 of our series. We're following the Jewish lectionary. And so we have a number of passages from Genesis that get grouped together. And kind of like with last week, with so many just amazing stories, here we go again. We get the story of the 3 visitors. We get the whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing. We even get the sacrifice of Isaac this week. I mean, there's a lot there to work with.
Yeah.
And so I'm really curious where you're going on my 3 questions today. So I'm not going to wait at all. We're going to get right to it. Where do you see the Messiah? Where is the Messiah so more just clearly just shining right at you in this one?
Well, I think we have to go to the sacrifice of Isaac.
Yeah.
That is the climax of the Abraham story. And when you're following through Genesis, if you're noticing, how many pages are devoted to which person in Genesis, the most pages are devoted to Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as you're done with the sacrifice of Isaac, Abraham almost disappears.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a little bit about him, you get his death, and then we're on to Isaac. So this is clearly the climax,
Mm-hmm.
right? And very clearly we have passages in the Old Testament that are intended to point us to things in Jesus' life by kind of analogy. And so God will provide the sacrifice, God says to Isaac as they're going up. And in fact, that's what God does in Jesus Christ,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we have this kind of picture of the sacrifice of Jesus kind of rehearsed in advance through the sacrifice of Isaac. Take your son, your only son, the one you love. Well, isn't that what Jesus is with God?
Mm-hmm.
He's the one that's beloved of the Father. This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased, we hear at Jesus' baptism, right? So this whole story of the sacrifice of Isaac is intended to kind of be a foreshadowing of the greater sacrifice that's going to come with Jesus. Now, of course, we can see the differences too. Isaac isn't actually sacrificed. He doesn't die. Mm-hmm. There needs to be a substitute for him, which we have in the ram that's caught in the thicket, and Abraham eventually will sacrifice instead of Isaac. Mm-hmm. But we see the anguish of a father who has to give up his son, just like our Heavenly Father has to give up his son. We see the son obedient to the Father, just like Jesus is obedient to the will of his Father. All these things are kind of foreshadowed for us here in the Old Testament. And I don't want this to sound like this story is unique. We have a number of these foreshadowings in the Old Testament. Obviously, all the sacrifices that we meet in the book of Leviticus in some ways foreshadow Jesus' sacrifice. So we have this kind of pattern in the Old Testament matched by the fulfillment of Jesus in the New Testament. But the one that really stands out in the life of Abraham is the sacrifice of Isaac. And that's where we go really to see the climax of the Abraham story and the connection between Abraham's story of anguish at the sacrifice of his son with the father's anguish over having to send his son into the world to sacrifice him for us.
Yeah. So for a lot of people, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but I feel like a lot of Christians will just really laser focus on the New Testament, and they get Jesus. And I mean, it's powerful enough to hear of God's Son who is sacrificed for our sake. Maybe speak a little bit to the importance of stories like this to understand Jesus. What are we missing in Jesus if we don't know the story of the sacrifice of Isaac?
Well, I think what we're missing in Jesus then is Jesus is not something new, right? When Jesus comes on the scene, it's like, okay, we want to focus on that. We want to do that as our focus, but he's not something new. He's the plan all along.
Yeah.
And when Jesus teaches, most of his teaching isn't anything new. It's just pointing out what was there all along in the Old Testament. He's opening the eyes of his disciples and, of course, the readers of the gospel to see that, oh, it was there all along.
Yeah.
It's just that in Jesus it becomes much easier to see
Sure.
when he's on the scene, as it were, and when he's speaking to us in the words that are recorded in the Gospels. But much of Jesus' teaching is drawn directly from the Old Testament. And you have to look really hard to say, well, there's a theme in what Jesus teaches that I can't find in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. It's all there. And I think that's on purpose, that the New Testament is so heavily recycling the Old Testament and bringing it to it, because it's saying that this is all part of God's plan all along, mm-hmm. and it's not new. And so when the gospel comes in our generation too, it might be new to us.
Sure.
We get excited about it, but it's not new.
It's nothing.
It wasn't new in Jesus' day. It was perhaps new in Adam's day when he got the first promise.
Yes, it was new.
But since then, it's not new.
Yeah. And I asked the question simply because it's a huge reason why we're doing this, right? Why are we spending the time in Genesis? And why are we using that as a foundation? Because I've been blessed in that the more I know the Old Testament, the more just Jesus jumps off the page, and I'm reading the things that he's saying, and it's just like, oh wow, and I just want to encourage all of our people too, that this is really the best way for us to know Jesus, is to know all of these stories and all of these prophecies that lead up to him. It's just that important. Okay, I want to get behind things a little bit. Find that nugget that you find really interesting. So what do you see in these passages that just jumps out at you?
Yeah, well, there's something at the very beginning, chapter 18. Mm-hmm. We have these three visitors show up to Abraham, right? Abraham pleads for Sodom and Gomorrah because he knows Lot's down there, and he wants Lot. And then the next story is, of course, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and how God saves Lot out of that. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to kind of read these two as, okay, this is a Bible story, that's a Bible story. And that's kind of maybe if we went to Sunday school as a child, we did one week, we did one the other week. But what Moses has done when he's written these chapters is he's tied them together closely so that you see how meticulous God is in keeping his promise to Abraham. When Abraham negotiates God down, right, God goes beyond what Abraham negotiates. If there's 5, will you spare it? Sure. God can't even find 5.
Yeah.
Right? But nevertheless, God knows what Abraham really is concerned about. That's his nephew Lot. And so these two are connected. And I have this in my commentary.
Okay.
In a chart. And I don't remember everything I've written ever. So I'm going to use my commentary to kind of talk about how Moses has put these parallels in between the two stories.
Okay. So,
in 18:1, first verse, Abraham's sitting at the door of his tent, the entrance to his tent, right? At 19:1, Lot is sitting at the entrance to the city. Both men at the entrance. Abraham goes out when he sees these 3 men coming and greets them. Lot gets up and greets the 2 angels that are coming. They look like men to him. Abraham bows to them. Lot bows to the men that come to him. Abraham invites the men in. Lot invites the men in. They both mention washing their feet. Let me wash your feet, right? This is something you do. We have it all, Jesus' famous washing of the feet. Mm-hmm. Both men offer to have these visitors' feet washed. Both that say, stay with me and then you can go on your way. They both say similar things about that. They both have bread baked for the men. Even that. In the story about Abraham and the three visitors, we get this famous moment where Sarah laughs. In the story about Lot having these two visitors, and he tries to warn his sons-in-law about, we got to get out of here. It says they thought he was joking. Now, in Hebrew, the word for laugh and the word for joke from the same root.
Mm-hmm.
So he uses that connection too. There's a great outcry against Sodom that God notes in chapter 18 when he's visiting with Abraham. And then we get the people's outcry in the city in Sodom in chapter 19 when they're trying to get at these two visitors to Lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The idea of the city being swept away, and Abraham says, will you sweep away the righteous with the innocent? And then Lot is warned, get out of the city or you're going to be swept away. Okay? And we have another play on words that you can't see in English, but it's there in Hebrew. God says he's going to spare the whole place for the sake of 5. And God says to Lot when he requests, can I go not so far, just this little city, I'll grant your request. Now you go, how do those connect? Well, the word for spare and the word for grant are the same word in Hebrew. It's just different contexts. We translate them different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So again, another word play. And then finally, we have the destruction of the city, which is prominent in both of them. And God uses the word, this is what I'm going to do, in both, do meaning destroy the city. So we have all these connections that Moses has built in so that we see that God not just makes this promise to Abraham, he goes beyond the promise of Abraham in delivering Lot. Mm-hmm. And we see this great commitment of God to his people, right? Lot, we find out in the New Testament's a righteous man. He probably shouldn't have been down in Sodom. There are lots of righteous believers who do things they shouldn't do. Mm-hmm. All of us, basically.
Sure.
But God loves his people. He makes a promise to Abraham, and he goes above and beyond that promise. God goes above and beyond for us, too, all the time. Yeah. Probably in ways that we never even imagine or perhaps even realize. And so Moses, by tying these two sections together with all these parallels, is trying to get the reader to see this. And some of it's hard to see in an English translation, unfortunately. But some of it you can still see, and that's the point, is it's not just two Bible stories. It's really one story, not about Abraham's request or Lot's escape, but about God's faithfulness and even super faithfulness. Mm-hmm. And his love that, rescues his people even when, they're not always behaving the way they should.
Wow. So I think what's amazing for us is to know that these stories are being crafted. I think sometimes when we tell a story, we don't even think about the way we're telling the story. But even the way the stories are crafted, the way they are told, is part of the storytelling. The way it's coming together is actually telling you something beyond just the things that are happening in the story.
Right. And it's it's something that should be obvious that always isn't obvious to us, is that we're not getting everything about Abraham's life. Moses is picking and choosing events from Abraham's life, and that in itself is a crafting activity.
Sure.
Right? He doesn't tell us how often Abraham had cornflakes for breakfast or whatever, right? It might be interesting to know, but he's not interested in telling us that. And in some ways, this makes history telling in the Bible have a parallel with all kinds of history telling. After all, if you're going to write, say, the history of the Eisenhower administration, sure, right? You're going to pick out what you think are the most important events. You're not going to tell us everything Dwight Eisenhower did every day and every minute, right? you're going to pick out, if you're the historian, what you think is important for readers to know. Well, the same thing happens in the Bible for a higher purpose. The writer of Genesis, Moses, or the writer of Kings, or the writers of the Gospels, or the book of Acts, they are picking and choosing events that illustrate for us what we need to know about God and our relationship with Him. And so they go beyond that too, and they craft the stories, as you talked about, so that we have these parallels, so that if we're reading carefully, we see, oh, this is what's going on there. This is what it's trying to tell us. They very carefully oftentimes choose their wording, or they will choose similar events so that we begin to pick up on these parallels and make these connections. So that's an important thing, easily overlooked.
It is. It really is. And it was something that I honestly, I mean, growing up and even it took me really going to the seminary to see just how highly crafted it was. And even to this day, I'm finding more. Just reading your commentary, I'm finding more that's there that I just wasn't able to see. You mentioned a historian choosing certain parts of the story because they're important. What part of this story would you choose, as the historian, for us to focus on for our world today?
Yeah. Well, the one thing that occurred to me is Lot's daughters. We have this story of incest, right? They get dad drunk and they have children. And, I suppose it's real easy to think of these children as unfortunates and throwaways and pitiful. And in today's world, if we had a child that came from incest, there's a good chance that it might end up in an abortion clinic. But God doesn't allow that to happen with Lot's daughters. He even makes them into nations. Ammon and Moab, the nations come from them. And it shows us that, even though these children were conceived in a way that not exactly God's design, God still loves them too. And I think it's a message to us to be very, very conscious of the preciousness of life, God's concern for the life that He gave, and we need to be diligent in our day on life issues, not just abortion, but life issues in general. And I think the story of Lot's daughters and where these two nations come from, we could kind of, again, think of that as, oh, that's an unfortunate thing, and then read right over and keep going. But it's there for a reason. And it's not just there to tell us, oh, this is where the Ammonites and the Moabites came from. It tells us that. But it also tells us that God valued those lives in some way, that He allowed them to build nations. Those two boys that were born allowed them to build nations and bring people into the world. And He showered them with His love, just like He showers all the nations with His love. And I think it says to us that, people aren't disposable or throwaways or just somebody to be pitied because of the way they came into the world. But people are to be valued. And so we value the life of those who have unfortunate circumstances, not just to be pitying them, but to actually value them as human beings created by God, loved by God, redeemed by God in the blood of Jesus Christ. And so I think Lot's daughters and their children actually is a way of saying children aren't throwaways. People aren't throwaways. And we may think because someone has Down syndrome, they're less valuable. They're not less valuable. We may think that because a child was conceived in a certain way, it's all right to get rid of that child before they're born. That's not what God is telling us here. He's telling us quite the opposite.
Yeah. God has a plan for that child. God is going to use that. And sometimes God even uses the unfortunate circumstance to do something that would have never happened under normal circumstance. I mean, we see that over in the Bible. We see it in history as well. And boy, I think that's a great reminder for all of us, the value of life, and boy, and how inadequate we are as the judge of that,
Yes.
right? I mean, we really need to submit that one to God and say, God, even in these difficult circumstances, you are God, and you can do beautiful things even in the midst of it. Wow, thank you so much
You're welcome.
for sharing with us today. All right, small groups, it's your turn. Time to open up those scriptures and share with one another. We've got a lot to talk about. See you next time.